Hi, this is Dr. Kingston, and in this video we'll be talking about the oral cavity. Our objective to accomplish here is simply to define the boundaries and subdivisions of the oral cavity and to describe their contents. Now, the oral cavity tends to be one of those areas that we're all very familiar with, but because we use it we never really think about it in terms of anatomical terminology. So let's start out just by attaching some hard anatomical boundaries to this sort of semi-defined area that we think of as our mouth. So let's start with the most familiar boundaries. Anteriorly, we have the lips, and laterally, we have the cheeks. The superior boundary is the palate, and this includes both the hard palate anteriorly and the soft palate posteriorly. If we follow the edge of the soft palate, so here where I am indicating, follow that inferiorly, it creates a fold of mucosa that we're going to call the palatoglossal arch because it goes between the palate and the tongue, and that marks the posterior boundary of the oral cavity. Posterior to here, we run into this region of the oropharynx called the fauces, which is where the palatine tonsil sits. So that's what this lumpy structure right there is. All right. Finally, the inferior border of the oral cavity is not the floor of the mouth, as you might guess. It's the mylohyoid muscle, and that makes a little sling between the right and left sides of the mandibular body. So these structures sitting here between the oral floor mucosa and the mylohyoid muscle are still considered part of the oral cavity, as we will see. Right, the oral cavity is a relatively large space. So when we're talking about it, we're going to break it down into some smaller subdivisions based on the position of the teeth. The portion of the oral cavity internal to the teeth is the oral cavity proper. So that's the portion in yellow here. And this is going to include the tongue. All right, so that's our biggest area. The other is the portion external to the teeth, shown in blue here, and that is the oral vestibule. And that is simply that empty space between your teeth and gingiva and the surrounding lips. All right, so let's take a look at the structures present in each subdivision in a little bit more detail. There aren't many big structures that jump out at you in the oral vestibule. Most of this is just an empty space. What we do see here are some specializations of the gingivae. So we have two labial frenula. So a maxillary labial frenulum superiorly and a mandibular labial frenulum inferiorly. These are folds of fibroelastic connective tissue covered by mucosa that help to anchor the lips to the gingivae. We also have a good view of the anterior and buccal surfaces of the teeth from the oral vestibule. And you might notice that these teeth in particular here have something kind of weird going on. So if you look at this inferior tooth row, you can find this very large tooth right here. And it looks very out of place compared to the others. So this is a fusion of the lateral mandibular incisor and the canine right next to it. This is a pretty rare occurrence, and I didn't actually even notice it until I was going back through my image bank this year, because you so rarely see it. I'd never bother keeping an eye out for it. But it's kind of cool to look at all the same. All right, so back to business. The other big group of structures that we tend to find in and around the oral cavity are salivary glands and their related structures. The biggest of these is the opening of the parotid duct, which empties into the oral vestibule here through a little papilla just lateral to the second maxillary molar. You can actually find this pretty easily on yourself in the mirror just by gently retracting your teeth. Retracting your teeth, that's a good one. Retracting your cheek and having a look. In addition to this big opening for saliva, there are many, many minor salivary glands embedded in the mucosa of the oral vestibule as well. You're not likely to find those ones in the mirror, though. All right, so moving into the oral cavity proper, the largest and most obvious structure we find in here is the tongue, and specifically we find the body of the tongue, or the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. The posterior third, or the root of the tongue, is located posteriorly in the oropharynx. The tongue is a muscular structure that's lined by mucosa, so much like the rest of the oral cavity. It's anchored to the floor of the mouth by the lingual frenulum, which is also made up of fibroelastic connective tissue, just like the labial frenula that we saw for the lips. Now, normally, this is going to anchor the tongue down without impeding its movements, but on occasion, it can grow too large or attach too anteriorly along the tongue's length. When you have a condition like that, it's called ankyloglossia, but it's more commonly referred to as a tongue tie. It can cause some speech impediments if it's really severe, and the picture here is showing a really severe tongue tie. But more often, it's found and corrected early on because children that have a tongue tie also very often have difficulty latching while they're nursing. But this poor kid here managed to get all their teeth in before it got treated. The space between the tongue and the palate is relatively open. It's a passageway for things that we eat and we drink, so that's not really surprising. But the space between the tongue and the mucosal floor then is filled up with several important structures relating to salivary glands. So here again, we see that lingual frenulum anchoring the tongue down to the mucosa. And then on either side of that, you can see a little bump. All right, and that little bump there is called the sublingual caruncle, or lingual caruncles. That's one of my favorite anatomical terms. These are just openings for the ducts of the submandibular salivary glands. They're surrounded with some connective tissue for protection, and that also allows them to stand up as little bumps and keep opening open or patent. All right. If we move out laterally from those little caruncles, we end up on a ridge of tissue called the sublingual folds. Now, the lump underneath this ridge are the sublingual salivary glands, and instead of having one big duct like the submandibular or the parotid glands, they have a bunch of tiny little ducts that open up in a line along this ridge. So you can see this illustrated for you down here in the corner illustration. And they're very difficult to see with your naked eye, so you kind of have to interpolate them as existing along this ridge here in the photograph. The sublingual space refers to the region of the oral cavity that exists sandwiched between that oral mucosal floor that we just looked at and the mylohyoid muscle. Now, there is enough going on in the sublingual space that we've assigned it its very own learning objective in video. So for now, I just want to briefly mention its name and explain that this is where we actually find some of the structures that we saw opening up into the oral cavity proper. So the sublingual glands are here. Portion of the submandibular gland can also be found here, as well as its duct. This is also the region where we're going to find most of the neurovasculature that supplies the tongue traveling, but we will get to all of that in due time. All right, that is the end of the material for this session, so here is your review question. The parotid papilla can be palpated in the oral blank, immediately lateral to the second blank molar. And the correct answer here was D. The parotid papilla can be palpated in the oral vestibule, immediately lateral to the second maxillary molar. All right. And that brings us to the end. Thank you for joining me.